Welcome to the third and sadly last in a series of webinars co-chaired by the Jewish Community Relations Councils of Hartford and the Hartford and New Haven Jewish Federation. My name is Betty Levy. I co-chair the New Haven Jewish Community Relations Council with my husband, Arthur. Our speaker is Avi Melamed, a former senior official for the Israeli government in intelligence and counterterrorism throughout the Middle East. He currently is founder and CEO of Inside the Middle East Intelligence Perspectives and an expert on current affairs in the Arab and Muslim worlds and their impact on Israel. Most notably, his distinctly, and I emphasize this, non-partisan curriculum has been presented at schools, universities, and governments, and uses intelligence methodology to examine the Middle East. His latest book is Inside the Middle East and helps its readers understand regional events as they unfold. And they're really unfolding now. Avi has so far lectured for us. The first one was on annexation. The second was how we can make Israel a uniting, not dividing issue. And today is on superpowers of the Mideast and their impact on Israel. He will focus on Iran and Turkey and how they impact on Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. There will be a roughly 30-minute presentation followed by questions and answers. We are going to ask you to use your Q&A, and it is my very real pleasure now, because I have learned so much from the first two webinars, and I look forward to learning even more from this one. And God knows we all need it with what's going on in the world today. I introduce Avi Melamed. Thank you. Thank you very much, Avi.
Shalom from Israel, Betty. Thank you so much for your very kind introduction. I just have to add something. You know, there has been recently, just in the last couple of hours, some developments here in Israel. So I would refer to that because to a large extent it is incorporated into the whole thing that I'm going to talk about in our session. So my introduction will be a little bit, or my presentation will be a little bit longer. I do apologize, but I understand, I'm sure that you will understand that the reasons for that. Just very shortly, a couple of hours ago, for the last few hours, there has been apparently some sort of an incident in the northern Israeli-Lebanese border. Details are not so clear as of now. The bottom line is, first, there are no casualties on the Israeli side. It's not clear exactly what happened. Apparently, there was some kind of an attempt of the Hezbollah to attack an Israeli military post. Again, as I emphasized, to the best of my knowledge, no casualties and fatalities on the Israeli side. We are still trying to understand this whole story. So we should be tuned to follow the events in that arena for the next couple of hours and, of course, for the next couple of days. Now, with your permission, I would like to turn into my presentation. And let me share with you the screen for the presentation that, as Betty said, deals with Israel's geostrategic landscape in the shape or under the impact of regional factors. And in my presentation, I will try to provide you with some snapshot of the current situation of Israel geostrategically speaking in that sense. However, I need to do some kind of like a framing. So with your permission, I will do some general framing just so we will be able to better understand the whole topic that I'm going to talk about. So in my presentation today, I will actually argue that Israel's geostrategic environment today is basically dictated by a conjunction of four major factors. One is ancient power struggle within Islam. The other one is an ancient power struggle between civilizations in the region. The third one is a contemporary power struggle over path, identity, and direction in the Middle East. And the last one is contemporary hegemonic ambitions. In my presentation, I will try to address three key questions. First, what are those factors? Second, why and how do they coincide right now? And third, how do they impact Israel's geostrategic landscape? Let me start shortly with the ancient factors. The first one is the Sunni Shiite split. You could see the year 680. Roughly speaking, the split centers around the question who should rule the Muslim world. The Sunnis are the majority of the Muslims, some 80%, stands for the concept of a merit-based, meaning whoever ruled the Muslim world should be the best man for the position. The other camp, minority of the Muslims in the world, the Shiites, some 17% or so, are standing for the concept of bloodline, arguing that actually whoever should rule the Muslim world must be a descendant of the fourth caliph of the Muslim empire, Ali bin Abi Talib, the son-in-law and cousin of Prophet Muhammad. That controversy and others that I wouldn't go into basically resulted in an uncompromising animosity and bloodshed since 680 between these two factors within Islam. The second ancient factor is a power struggle between civilizations in the Middle East, major civilization, namely the Arab, the Persian, and the Turkish civilization. Arab civilization gave birth to Islam. Most of the Arab predominantly are Sunni Muslims. Persian civilization is predominantly Shiite one, and the Turkish civilization is predominantly Sunni one. The difference, of course, is the ethnicity. Arabs are Arabs, Persians are Persians, Turks are Turks. I'm now moving forward to the 20th century. Basically, the significant Muslim frame that ruled the Middle East and the region for hundreds of years, that was the Turkish Ottoman Empire, come to an end following the First World War. And now the Middle East is facing a totally new reality in the beginning of the 20th century, when the Middle East is now introduced to the concept of statehood. In the Middle East, we witnessed the birth of a creature that was never really existing in this region, and this is called a national statehood. This is the century where we witnessed the birth of the Arab states across the Middle East. Roughly speaking, 100 years after the birth of Arab states in the Middle East, in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and so on, we actually look at a failed attempt. The Arab world was unable to successfully compromise the major components of identity: Islam, Arab, pan-Arab nationalism, citizenship, sectarianism. All those components the Arab world failed to really overcome in order to create sense of national unity and real independent statehood. The outcome of that was dictatorship in the Arab world and the failure of the Arab world. That failure led to, in different times during the 20th century, to a burst of mass protest. And the recent one, and the most significant one, is the one known by the term of the Arab Spring, or as I call it, the Arab Awakening, towards the end of 2010, when massive riots shook the Arab world from side to side, as you could see on the map. And in the essence of the Arab Spring is the demand of the people, demanding the governments and rulers to provide them real answers for real problems: housing solutions, educational opportunities, medical services, security, running water, health systems, all the lethal things that in the end of the day, life is made of. So in the beginning of the 21st century, we are in a situation where majority of the people in the Middle East, the Arab world, which is some almost 400 million people, is experiencing a massive turbulence as an accumulative outcome of the failure of the statehood in the Arab world. It is exactly the time when the historical rivalries of the Arabs, meaning the Turks and the Persians, finding the time to move forward, take advantage of the disintegrating, turbulent Arab states in order to try and to enhance their hegemonic vision. And in the beginning of the 21st century, and right now, we are witnessing this major power struggle, where on the one hand, Arab national statehood is at the stake, while its major historical rivalries, Turkey and Iran, are trying to enhance their visions or ideals of becoming the dominant superpower in the region at the expense of the Arab world. Let us start with the Iranians' hegemonic vision. King Abdullah II of Hussein defined that hegemonic vision very accurately by the name of the Shi'ite Crescent. He talked about the danger of the Iranian vision of hegemony, and he described it in a sense of a crescent, as you could see right in the map in front of you. And to a large extent, he was definitely accurate. When the mullahs came to power in Iran in 1979, the mullahs, by the way, are the Shiite rank of the Shiite clergies. You may be identify or know the term Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Revolution. Ayatollah was not his name, this is his rank. It's a very senior rank within the Shiite clergy. The hegemonic vision that was set by the Iranian new regime in 1979 is guided by the concept of exporting the Islamic Revolution. And one of the keys narrative that fueled that concept is going back to the year 680, where Islam split over the question who is entitled to lead the Muslim world. The Shiites, since that time, are convinced that the crown of leadership was taken away from them by the loathed Sunnis, and now it is their time, the Shiites' time, to claim back the crown that allegedly, according to the Shiite narratives, was taken away from them. This is one of the major powers that drives this concept of exporting the Islamic Revolution. Two major pillars were set to enhance the vision of the Iranian hegemonic vision. One is a creation of an axis that is known by the name of the axis of resistance, and the other was to enhance Iran's nuclear program. The concept of the resistance is a concept that is part of today's Middle East dictionary. You cannot understand the Middle East without understanding that concept of the Middle East, of the resistance, Al-Muqawamah in Arabic. As you could see, the terminology of Al-Muqawamah basically stands for a yearning for an alternate world order in the spirit of Islam and the eradication of Western influence in the Middle East. And most important, the unrelenting struggle against Israel until it is annihilated. This is a major concept that praised, nurtured, and carried out as part of the Iranian mullah regime vision. The task of that was appointed to the Iranian Al-Quds force. You could see two figures to the right-hand side of the picture. The one to the left you may be familiar with is the late commander of Al-Quds force, an elite force within the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Major General Qasem Soleimani, eliminated by the United States in January 2020. He was replaced by the general to the right-hand side, Ismail Qani, to head the Al-Quds force that its major task is to carry out the concept of exporting the revolution and building the network of proxies and agents around the Middle East and across the Middle East. And this is exactly what the Mullah regime has been doing, particularly in the last couple of decades, creating a network of proxies around the Middle East, and not so surprisingly, many of them are bordering Israel. So if you look to the left-hand side of the map, you could see Lebanon, an Arab state bordering Israel, basically ruled de facto by an Iranian proxy, the Hezbollah, established by the Iranians in the beginning of the 80s, massively armed by the Iranians, financed by the Iranians, to the point Hezbollah is the real boss in Lebanon, creating a state within a state in Lebanon, bordering Israel from the north. To the northeast, you could see another Arab state, Syria, which again is to a large extent controlled by the Iranians. You could see the logos or symbols of some militias, Afghan militias, Iraqi militias, Pakistani militias. All of them are Shi'ite militias, backed, nurtured, trained, armed, financed, guided by the Al-Quds force of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, scattered in different parts of Syria. To the right-hand side, you could see another arena bordering Israel, this time of the southwest of Israel, Gaza Strip. Two major Palestinian armed groups, Hamas, who rules Gaza Strip since 2007, and the second largest military organization in Gaza Strip, Islamic Jihad in Palestine. These are all members of this axis of resistance, Mihwar Al-Muqawamah, as it's called in Arabic, and the common denominator is that they are all backed, trained, armed, financed, and guided by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Note that Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Palestine are not Shiites, they are Sunnis. However, the common denominator is that they all vow to eliminate Israel through the use of violence. Another substantial component in this network of proxies nurtured and developed by Iran is based in Iraq, in the shape of different Iraqi Shiite militias that are budgeted by the Iraqi government. They are operating kosherly according to Iraqi government and parliament law, but their loyalty is given to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. A fascinating process for itself to understand how did it happen, which maybe sometime, some other occasion, we'll have the opportunity to elaborate on that. Again, like in the story of the militias, the Shiite Iranian-backed militias like Hezbollah, like the Afghan, the Pakistani militias in Syria, in Lebanon, as well as the Sunni militias of Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Palestine that are backed by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. The same here with the story of those Shiite militias in Iraq that are guided and trained and subdued to the orders of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. In another part of the region, in the far end of the Arab Peninsula, Yemen, a crumbling state, massively engaged in endless wars, the Mullah regime has also a stronghold in the shape of local Shiite tribes in Yemen called Houthis. You see here the leader, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, and their militias called Ansar Allah. Again, massively supported by the Iranians, trained, guided with the best weapons the Iranian can offer them. The Iranian regime indeed create this crescent as foreseen by King Abdullah II, and in the last 2 decades, taking advantage of the crumbling Arab states, taking advantage of the turbulence of the Arab Spring the Mullah regime was able to deepen its infiltration to the heart of the Arab world, disguised under the slogan of the resistance. We are fighting Israel. That is the cover used by the Iranian regime to expand its influence. So when we look from space at this whole master plan of the Mullah regime, now you could see from space the way it's looked. If you look at the upper part of the picture, you could follow my cursor, you could see all these logos of these Iranian-backed militias that I mentioned earlier. And you could see this red circle that stands for a most significant component in the Iranian blueprint master plan. This is what we call the Iranian land corridor, stretching from Iran, crossing through Iraq into Syria, ending up in Lebanon, offshore the Mediterranean Sea, the Iranian hegemonic vision. This is one of the most significant components of that vision, and the Iranians strive to create their influence on the ground, to perpetuate and to ensure and deepen their grip in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, through the armed proxies that they have scattered in those areas. Indeed, today, the people of Lebanon and Iraq are struggling to gain their independence from the Iranian suffocating grip. They are facing long, bloody battle for independence and freedom, and I cannot say decisively they will win this war. They will have to pay with blood for that. And part of this Iranian Mullah regime corridor idea is to actually create a strangling loop around Israel's neck, using those proxies, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Shi'ite militants scattered in Iraq, in Syria, the Iraqi militias that are supporting the Iranian presence in Syria. The idea is those militias, the weapons, the missiles that will stream through this corridor that you see right in front of you, those weapons, missiles, and sophisticated arsenal of weapons will be directed at Israel when the time will come and basically fulfill the end purpose of eliminating the state of Israel. That is the reason why the state of Israel has been acting hundreds of times against Iranians and their proxies in Syria to eliminate their infiltration, to eliminate their military advanced capacities, and Israel will act, if needed, hundreds of times more to prevent that. The Iranian master plan of creating land corridors stretching from Iran to the Mediterranean is nothing less than an existential threat to the state of Israel. You could see here on this satellite image also the southern part of this Iranian idea or crescent, the Houthis that are controlling this strategically enormous passage of Bab el-Mandeb, connecting the Red Sea right here that connects the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean. This is enormously significant strategic development that took place in the last 2 decades or less. But the story doesn't end here, because now we have to deal with another hegemonic vision. We'll turn to that in a minute, not before just mentioning another component of the Iranian hegemonic vision program, and this is its nuclear program. In 2015, the US, the Western leaders, signed an agreement with the Mullah regime known as the JCPOA. Basically, the bottom line of that, to make a long story short, unfortunately, in spite of maybe the good intentions of the Western negotiators, Iran did not become a more reasonable, fair player following the JCPOA. The opposite is the accurate situation. Iran became more aggressive, boosted its aggression around the region, increasing the tension and the death toll in different parts of the Middle East. The new administration, President Trump's administration, recognized the threat the Iran presents to the region. As you may recall, in May 2018, Trump's administration withdrew from the JCPOA, and ever since, President Trump administration has been applying a massive maximum pressure policy on Iran, trying to use sanctions as a means to basically stop and thwart the Iranian hegemonic vision. And again, this hegemonic vision is based upon two major components: the spread of armed proxies and subcontractors, and the developing of a nuclear program, including for a military purpose, that will be encompassed within advanced missile capacities. These are the two legs upon which the Iranian hegemonic vision is based upon. And that brings us to another major regional player hegemonic vision, and that is Turkey. Turks are Sunnis, not Shiites. However, in the last 2 decades, under the leadership of Erdogan, who basically took Turkey, once a secular, I would say, state, even though to a large extent secular dictatorship in a way, and basically turned it into an Islamic dictatorship. Erdogan totally changed Turkey from side to side, and he is leading an hegemonic vision. In Erdogan visions, the glorious day of the Ottoman Empire should be renewed. It is time to re-control the Middle East, and it's time for Turkey and him, Erdogan, to be the new Sultan. Looking at this map illustrates majority of the people in the Middle East are indeed Sunnis, like the Turks. And indeed, Erdogan has strong cards to play with. But the one most significant component is that overwhelmingly the Arabs definitely do not miss the good old days of the Ottoman Empire. So here you see already the seeds of collision that we'll talk about it shortly. Just the same. Guided by this concept of reviving the days of the Ottoman empires, Erdogan positioned himself as the patron of both political as well as militant Islam factors in the region. Namely, when we talked about political Islam, obviously the Muslim Brotherhood, the biggest mass movement in the Muslim Sunni world. Erdogan is coming from the womb of the Muslim Brotherhood. He is an Islamist in his ideology and outlook. But that is not enough. Erdogan is also nurturing, supporting militant Islam groups like ISIS, like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, once Al-Qaeda affiliated group operating in the northern part of Syria. Guided by his vision, by his ambition to be the new Sultan of the Middle East in the 21st century, to be the leader of the Sunni world of the Middle East, which, reminding you, is predominantly Arab, not Turk. Erdogan has been advancing his vision using the cards of patroning political Islam and militant Islam groups. You could look and see in the map in front of you, in the northern shore of the Middle East, bordering the Mediterranean, in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Libya, where you have presence of Muslim Brotherhood as well as militant Islam groups. Turkey was able to create and is able to create a stronghold on the ground. In fact, in Libya, Turkey has also military stronghold on the ground in the shape of militant that Turkey sends from northern part of Syria and other places to fight in Libya in a civil war that has been going on since the middle of the second decade of the 21st century. So Turkey establishes a military presence, both directly as well as through proxies in Libya. In the northern part of Syria, something similar. Turkey controlled and occupies parts of the northern part of Syria. Turkish forces, military forces, are in the northern part of Syria. Turkish-backed militant Islam groups in the northern part of Syria are acting as Turkish proxies in the northern part of Syria. Turkey nurtures and maintains relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood and other militant and Islamic political group in Egypt, the largest and biggest Arab state. Turkey supports Hamas, who defines itself as the branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. In the Gulf state, Turkey has presence in Qatar, including military presence in Qatar. In the south part of Yemen, Turkey also nurtures presence through the use of Muslim Brotherhood affiliated militias in south part of Yemen. The same goes as for the Horn of Africa right here, Somalia, where Turkey also has bases, military bases. In other words, the same way the Iranians are expanding their hegemonic vision through the use of subcontractors, through the use of proxies, Turkey is using its patronage over militant Islam groups and political Islam groups, as well as some places where it has direct military presence. Turkey uses those components to expand its control over the region. Turkey and Iran are to a large extent bitter rivalry. Turkeys are Sunnis, the Iranians are Shiites. Turkey wants to lead the Arab Muslim Sunni world. Iran wants to be the one controlling that. There is a lot of seeds of collision between the two hegemonic visions. They do maintain relationship on the one hand, in some parts even some tight relationship, but on the other hand, there are lots of sources of tensions, conflict, collision between the two that are non-bridgeable. However, they have two major common denominators. One, each and every one of them wants to be the regional superpower, the one that leads the region, that dictates the politics of the region. Second common denominator is that both Turkey and Iran are using the Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as a pawn in the service of their hegemonic ambitions. Turkey in Iran supports Hamas, Islamic Jihad. Turkey in Iran echoes the terminology that speaks about liberating Al-Quds, the Arab name of Jerusalem. Here you see in front of you, for example, these two images. The one to the right says Al-Quds. This is a poster recently published by the Mullah regime, by the Iranians, basically echoing the concept of we are on our way to liberate Jerusalem. This is a message that basically is supposed to harvest political dividends in the Arab world, and this is quite successfully working. Obviously, the Iranians couldn't care less about the Palestinians. If you look to the left-hand side, you see the famous Hagia Sophia, just now at the head of the media news. The reason that I bring that picture into this context is because Erdogan, that now turned Hagia Sophia once again into a mosque, defying the Christians and the West openly, basically used that same story to say the same way we liberated Hagia Sophia, we will liberate Al-Quds. Erdogan, like the Iranians, couldn't really care less about the Palestinians. But both are making a very effective use at the pawn called the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Iran and Turkey's one of their most significant interests is to make sure that the flames of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will always be there. And if they can further fuel the flames, the better. So when you look from an Israeli perspective at the challenges presented these two hegemonic visions, you are looking at a very interesting, challenging, complex geostrategic landscape. Israel's geostrategic borders are exceeding today thousands of miles to the east, to the south, to the west, as an outcome of this enormous geostrategic reshaping of the Middle East. Looking at this map shows you the major arenas that are actually assembling Israel's geostrategic landscape. West of Israel is the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. You could see the symbols, Turkey, Iran, and you could see how they have presence in this region for their own reasons, as I mentioned before. Something very significant to be said about the eastern basin of the Mediterranean with its enormous gas reservoirs. One of the major gas fields is the Leviathan field in Israel's waters, territorial water. This is one of the most significant assets, strategically speaking, for the states in the region that are bordering the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. Obviously, Israel is one of the most significant ones. There is a plan to carry gas from the eastern basin of the Mediterranean to Europe. The enormous amount of gas contained in this region are supposed to be an enormous source of income for some of the states of this basin, and including particularly Israel. If you look to the east, we talked about the Iranian land corridor and the threat it presents to Israel, and why Israel and how Israel insist to prevent the realization of that land corridor. But also when you look down to the south and you look at the Red Sea that connects the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal with the Indian Ocean, this is yet another significant stage as far as Israel is concerned from a geostrategic perspective. The maritime, the ships, the commercial movement of ships crossing through the Red Sea, leading to Israel here, to the south part, to the Gulf of Eilat, to the city of Eilat, a major Israeli harbor, and right across to the Jordanian major harbor of Aqaba. The Red Sea is yet another enormous, significant stage for the state of Israel from a geostrategic perspective. You may not be surprised then to know that Iran's agent or ally in Yemen, the Houthis, are threatening to shoot ballistic missiles at Israel. Israel's geostrategic borders are very much different from the one you may be familiar with on the regular maps. They are stretching all the way down to the Horn of Africa right here, to the Bab el-Mandab Strait. They are stretching to the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, offshore Cyprus, right here, Greece, Libya. They are stretching eastwards all the way to Tehran. They are stretching southeast all the way to the Hormuz Strait at the Arab or the Persian Gulf. And you could see, looking at this map, how the hegemonic vision of Iran and Turkey present and shapes these geostrategic new boundaries of the state of Israel. Understanding that, we can understand what I'm going to show you right now. The hegemonic counter-alliance. Israel is not alone facing this hegemonic challenge, both the Turkish and the Iranian. Major Arab states and others, regional players, are part of this alliance together with Israel that actually tries to block, to thwart, to stop, to limit both the Turkish ambitions as well as the Iranians' ambitions. So looking at this map, now you could understand, based upon what I showed you before, the structure of this alliance and how it operates in the different arenas. And you could see easily that flag time and again in these alliances, Israel's flag. The alliance include major Arab states, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Jordan. These are all states that are part of this alliance because they are sharing joint strategic interest. The hegemonic vision of Turkey and Iran presents not only Israel, it presents Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the Gulf states, a major challenge. And in the new landscape of the Middle East, this new geostrategic landscape of the Middle East, that is the reason why we see the forming of this counter alliance. In the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, we should add Cyprus and Greece joining that alliance, because in the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, they must stop and limit Erdogan's ambition to be the one who take over control over the huge natural gas reservoirs in this region. In the Red Sea, you could see the alliance of Jordan, Israel, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and in the back stage, even Sudan, not so long ago, an Iranian ally that now was flipping sides. And again, their interest is to secure traffic, maritime, in the Red Sea, not to leave it to the mercy neither of Iran nor Turkey. That is why the importance of Bab el-Mandab Strait for these states. But if you look here, you could also see that further down at the Indian Ocean, south of Yemen, you could see this alliance in action again, basically focusing both Bab el-Mandab as well as the Hormuz Strait and the Arab Gulf. Right here, offshore of Yemen, there is a group of islands not so well known in the world. It's called the Sectary Island, which is basically one of the hottest spots today in terms of the geopolitics of the Middle East, including Israel. It is located thousands of miles away from Israel. Look at the map. You may wonder, what is the importance? Well, this group of islands, the Sectary Islands, basically dominate the major cruise route of maritime, of commercial shipping. And only recently, after a fight, a fierce fight, United Arab Emirates, local allies were able to take control at the Sectary Islands, basically pushing and ending the rule of Turkish-backed militias, Islamic Muslim Brotherhood militias that were backed by Turkey. In other words, this is a power struggle that exceeds way beyond the boundaries we know and we are familiar with. And this is one of the examples of that. So we are looking at a totally new shaped landscape, geopolitically speaking. And finally, right here, you could see once again, you may be able to see this yellow arrow pointing at Jordan, the Hashemite kingdom. Yet again, another enormously significant stage as far as Israel's geostrategic security needs requires, but not only Israel. Notice once again the allies that are basically concerned and make sure to secure Jordan. Israel, Jordan, of course, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. Jordan is enormously significant because it acts as the northern gatekeeper of the Arab Peninsula, as well as the eastern gatekeeper of Israel. And that explains why Jordan is so significant for this hegemonic counter alliance. In the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century, we are looking at a totally different geopolitical, geostrategic landscape of the Middle East that on the one hand presents Israel an enormous challenges. The Turkish and the Iranian hegemony present Israel with major challenges. On the other hand, it presents Israel unprecedented coalition, alliance with major players in the region, major Arab states. And this is something that is unprecedented. And just to conclude my presentation, to go back to the very first thing that I was mentioned, talking about today's incident in North Israel, the Israeli-Lebanese border. This is yet again an example to what I was saying before when I was talking about the challenge that the Iranian land corridor presents to Israel. And I was talking about the presence of the Hezbollah, the most powerful Iranian proxy in Lebanon. Lebanon doesn't really exist. It became an Iranian satellite. That is the fact why a Lebanese factor that is part of the Lebanese government, actually rules the Lebanese government, is basically bypassing everything and allow himself to attack Israel. This is part of the newly shaped geostrategic landscape of the Middle East and the way it impacts Israel from both ends, the challenges as well as the prospects. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, I'm opening this briefing to your questions and comments.
Well, Avi, thank you again for another incredibly informative presentation. I'm Judy Alpern, the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater New Haven, and with thanks to our colleagues in Greater Hartford for bringing all of these three wonderful programs together. We do have a few questions. Folks are reminded to put your questions in the question and answer block. So let's begin here. One person writes, Hamas has ties to both Iran and Muslim Brotherhood. Which group really controls their agenda?
Ideologically, spiritually, emotionally, Hamas is first and foremost part of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Muslim Sunni world. Hamas is Sunni. Hamas is playing the game. In other words, he's looking for anyone who will support him. So Hamas obviously embraced the Iranian support, which obviously serves the Iranian hegemonic vision, as I explained earlier. But notice that this is about cold, cynical political calculation, because in the last couple of years, there has been a cut between Hamas and the Iranians because of the war in Syria. Iran occupies Syria, butchering Syrians who are predominantly Sunnis. Hamas, that enjoyed the warm Iranian hug, was facing a criticism in the Arab world, which is predominantly Sunni and Arab, like Hamas. And Hamas was basically asked to make a decision to stay within the Iranian hugging or to go back to his natural hub, the Sunni Arab world. Hamas went back to the Sunni Arab world, and he was punished by the Iranians, who actually cut their civilian support, not their military support, to Hamas military forces as a Din al-Qassam brigade. So Hamas is playing in all the weddings. And by the way, after the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, went to Tehran to participate in the funeral. He was making a eulogy. And that eulogy and that act evoked a bitter debate within the Palestinians, including within Hamas. Because people says, how could you go and participate in the funeral of a person who is responsible for the butchering of hundreds of thousands of Sunni Syrians, including, by the way, more than 4,000 Palestinians in Syria? This is the real politics of the Middle East. And that's a good example of that.
Thank you for that. So, a question is, where does Iran get its money? if the United States sanctions supposedly are causing major economic problems there?
Iran's major revenue income source is, of course, the oil, and it doesn't exist. I mean, that the way it used to be. The Iranian budget is overwhelmingly based upon estimation of revenues from the oil selling. Today, the price of oil barrel and in the visible future is very low, which means Iran basically already deals with a huge deficit in its budget. The Iranian economy is to a large extent crushed. Iran's number one client is China, and the Chinese, like any other good client, are taking advantage of the situation. They buy oil from Iran in a low flat price, which basically keeps the Iranian regime a little bit over the water, nothing more than that. Iran's economic is in a dire situation. It's crumbling from within, and because the dependence on the oil revenue. There is another source of income. This is narcotic traffic, but the major one is oil revenue. Iran takes advantage of its control to a large extent over Iraq to flood Iraq with bad quality Iranian products. According to some estimation, we are looking at some $90 billion annual trade, which is to a large extent one direction. The Iraqis are not so happy with that. But all in all, the Iranian regime is mostly, almost totally dependent upon the revenue from oil. And as we know today, is in a dire situation.
Yeah, so while we stay on that line, one person writes that Hezbollah has strong ties to the Venezuelan regime and Hamas has Spanish news broadcast services in Latin America. Iran is becoming a player in Latin America, and Erdogan has been visiting the countries over the past few years. How do you see that situation developing, and do you see that region becoming more interesting to those parties?
Yes, that's a very valid perspective. Indeed, Iran, Hezbollah, and Turkey are actually quite massively involved in South America, particularly Iran and Hezbollah. Venezuela was mentioned, also Paraguay, Brazil, and other places. One of the major areas of activities centers around narcotic trafficking industry. The Hezbollah operates worldwide global economic chain of both legal and illegal entities that actually are a major income source that funds the organization in addition to the budget coming from Tehran. South America is a very significant area of interest. One of the ideas, by the way, of the Iranians is that in a way this is kind of like sneaking at the back doors of the United States. In other words, trying to create sort of like a threat from United States back door. So this is part of the strategic deployment, sort of speaking of Iran. Turkey the same way. Turkey is looking for all the time ways to expand its global outreach as part of like expanding particularly Erdogan's ambitions, I would say even megalomaniac ambitions. We talked about it earlier. South America is a definitely, as we well know, a major stage for the activities of Iran, Hezbollah, and Turkey.
So a question pops up. If Iran's economy is in so much trouble, and you described it as falling in on itself, how do they support militias in other countries? And I guess that would extend to their, what you stated as their control of the Lebanese government in Lebanon and the actions that we're now seeing, as to what the contextual reasons would be for that in terms of both their military and financial investment.
So in the story of Iraq, for example, it's mind-blowing. It's very cynical. Iran is controlling to a large extent Iraq, today to a lesser extent, because the Iraqi new government is trying to restore Iraq's sovereignty. But Iran controls Iraq through a network of militias, Iraqi militias, that are budgeted by the Iraqi money, the Iraqi oil money. I know it sounds crazy, but basically Iran is looting the Iraqi oil money to cover for the expenses of its militias in Iraq and beyond Iraq. The same applies as for, to a certain extent, in Syria, as though into a lesser extent. As I said before, Iran's major proxy, the Hezbollah, at its peak, enjoys some, according estimation, some $700 million Iranian support a year, meaning that all in all, the mullah regime in Tehran, since it came to power in the late 70s, in the 80s, Iran was engaged in an 8-year war with Iraq. Once it was over and Iran started to more and more divert its attention to expand its revolutionary mindset, i.e. building this network of proxies that I mentioned before, the 80s and onwards, the 90s and so on, Iran poured dozens and dozens of billions of dollars to build that network. This is one of the major sources of criticisms of the Iranian people who are dying of hunger, who are unemployed, who are suffocating in misery, who are brutally oppressed by the mullah regime. And the Iranian people are screaming at the street, why do you throw our money in Lebanon, in Syria, and Yemen, and Iraq? Use this money for us, the Iranian people, to help us. We don't want to get killed, not in Syria, not in Gaza, and not in Lebanon. We want the money to be used for our needs. And in that context, I must say, I found it very puzzling that there are some circles in the West who actually demand the West to cover or to pay for the inefficiency of the mullah regime to confront the challenge of the coronavirus in Iran. I found it mind-boggling, if I may use this term, because the mullah regime is diverting billions to establish networks of deadly militias, to develop a missile program and all kinds of weapons, to pursue a nuclear military capacities. And I found it very puzzling that there are circles in the West who think that the Western taxpayer should cover for the inefficiency or the unwillingness of the Iranian regime to address the challenges of its own people and to divert those huge funds to the welfare of the Iranian people. By the way, recently, Iran's President Rouhani said that they estimate that 25 million Iranians are infected by coronavirus. We are talking almost 1/3 of Iran. And that's mind-blowing.
Okay, so we have just a couple more questions. Do you think that the military alliance between Israel and the Sunni states will lead to a lasting peaceful relationship with full diplomatic and trade relations, or is it just a temporary military alliance of convenience?
As I said before, when I was analyzing the new geostrategic landscape of the region, we are looking at a long-term strategic alliance. I mean, given the challenges in the Arab world, the instability, the need of regimes to address the needs of their people, to create stability, we are looking at tasks that are decades away. I mean, it takes a long time. Now, if you add to that the need to confront a very aggressive, hegemonic vision of two major opponents of the Arab world, Turkey and Iran, as I mentioned before, when you take all these components together, I would say that we are not looking at something that is short-term or temporary. We are looking at a real strategic common denominators that are for a long term. Let us just take an example, the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. I was talking about the gas reservoir. Egypt and Israel shares huge part of that reservoir. They are already cooperating around the story of transferring that gas to Europe. This is a long-term strategic interest. Israel provides Jordan with gas that comes from the Israeli gas reservoir in the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. We are looking, the bottom line, I would say, we are looking at a long-term strategic alliance. And by the way, that totally new shaped geostrategic landscape of the Middle East has an enormous ramifications in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is not by chance that moving the US embassy to Jerusalem and acknowledging of the US administration of Israel's sovereignty in the Golan Heights, it is not by chance that the Arab major states' reaction to that was very mild and very mellow, mostly diplomatically speaking. It is not a chance because it has to do with the changes of priorities and agenda that is the outcome of the newly shaped geostrategic landscape of the Middle East. In the top priority of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, is to address their inner challenges, to confront and push back both the Turkish and the Iranian hegemony vision. These are two major ultra strategic interests of those players. And when they look around, they found a very reliable partner to that end. It's called Israel. That is the reason why the story of the Palestinian is pushed and downgraded enormously in the agenda and priorities of the major Arab states. It's about real politics.
So given the time and the hour, there's a few more questions, but I think it's best if I turn this over to Steve Raab to draw a conclusion to the program. But I just want to offer again my personal thanks. Avi, I always love listening and learning from you.
Thank you so much. My pleasure. Thank you for offering me the stage.
Thank you, Avi, and thank you, Judy, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Steve Raab, Chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council, or JCRC of Greater Hartford, which is part of the Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford. One of the many objectives of the JCRC is to enhance understanding of Israel and its relationship to its neighbors in the Middle East. I hope you found today's presentation as informative as I did. If you missed either of the first two webinars, you'll find recordings on our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and enter Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford in the search bar. We'll add today's recording within the next couple of days. Thanks again for attending, and stay well.